opinion of your humble host that the asteroid itself was not actually discovered only 4.5 days earlier. It is the opinion of your host that NASA had awareness of this asteroid long before that moment. But even if that's not the case, let's say for the moment they're telling us the truth, that it was only discovered on Wednesday, June 22nd, then what NASA is trying to tell you is that potentially hazardous objects can get that close to us, give us only a couple of days or a few days head start or notice, advance notice, before they come in and do the damage that they can potentially do. And if that, in fact, is the truth that NASA is disclosing, that is chilling and alarming enough as it is. But it is the opinion of your host that NASA was aware of this object long before that, and they waited for Earth-bound instruments and observational techniques to make the discovery of that object in much the same way that they waited for Earth-bound observations to make the discovery of a comet, which is known as Comet Elenin, or Elenin, based upon how you want to pronounce tomato or tomato. Comet Elenin, ladies and gentlemen, is massively, incredibly significant. We will cover more information on Comet Elenin in just a bit. Before I get to that point, I want to continue talking about NASA, some of its disclosures that it has made, and some of the reason why you need to be extremely, extremely alert as to the true role and the actual presence and the actual understanding that NASA holds. Now, your host is going to divert from our NASA conversation for just a moment to try to paint the picture of the significance of this. Many people out there, due to cognitive dissonance, ask themselves the question, wait, if there's all of this very important information, they surely would have shared it with us by now. Isn't that right? No, your host only asked you to turn your attention back in history to the time of the Manhattan Project. That was the program that involved the development of the atomic bomb, and that technology which led to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and kicked off the Cold War and the arms race of the Cold War. Keep this in mind. In the Manhattan Project, it's estimated that the scope, the scale of the number of people involved, and keep in mind, we're not just talking about hands and feet on the ground in factories doing the developments, the workers that built the factories, constructed all the facilities across New Mexico, other parts of the U.S. that were instrumental in the Manhattan Project. But we're also talking about the scientists themselves. We're also talking about military personnel, folks in the government, in the executive branch, that had varying degrees of awareness, but only a handful had the full picture of what the scope and what the ultimate objective of the Manhattan Project was all about. It's estimated that over 130,000 people at that time, in that window of time in the 40s, were talking about the same scale as the entire automotive industry in terms of personnel. That many people were involved, but probably fewer than 20 actually understood what the program and the project was about, its end use, its ultimate objective and or conclusion. How tight was the layer of secrecy of classified information? Well, here, this should provide you an example. April 12th, 1945 is the day that Harry Truman changed office from vice president to president following the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Truman had been vice president for 82 days at that time. Shortly after taking the oath of office, Truman said to reporters, I quote, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now. I don't know if you fellows ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." Now, folks, he was not simply referring to the death of FDR. What he was referring to is the briefing that he was provided immediately upon learning of the news of his death and in taking office. To give you more example, Truman, who had not known of the Manhattan Project beforehand, was briefed on the ultra-secret program by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson the day that Roosevelt died, following the first cabinet meeting as new president. Ladies and gentlemen, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's health had been failing for 20 years before the day that he died, and in that window of the months preceding his death, people were widely aware, well aware, that his death was imminent, that his condition was failing to such a strong regard, and yet the person who was one heartbeat away from assuming his office was kept ignorant of the Manhattan Project, ladies and gentlemen, was kept ignorant of the Manhattan Project until the moment that he took office. That, ladies and gentlemen, is compartmentalized information. That is the power of compartmentalization. That is the power of classifying information. And that is most definitely the power of considering information to be a measure or a matter of national security. That's just one microcosm. Your host could go on for hours on this subject, pointing to other examples of national security, its significance, its impact, etc. Now I want to turn our attention back to NASA, the space program that so many of us have been taught and have thought is an open and civilian program, a space agency, that its fullest intents and intentions are benign. We want to help mankind. We want to teach people about that which we don't know from outer space. And yet, as your humble host begins to read to you from the National and Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, Public Law 85-568. This was the originally enacted legislation by Congress of that time. There have been amendments made since. If you begin to do your research, don't be fooled by these amendments. Let's begin to read from the Act itself, beginning with the excerpt of the Declaration of Policy and Purpose. Your humble host is going to have to jump around in the article in order to make time and create time for the rest of the hour. The Congress declares that the general welfare... Actually, I'm going to take a break. Before we get into the body of the Act, we'll just pause here. I'll point you to have the opportunity during our commercial break that we're about to take to do some of the research on your own. Check for yourself. Did Harry Truman really say that? Absolutely, he did. He came into office as one of the most popular presidents of all time, left office as perhaps the most unpopular. When we come back from the break, we'll talk about why. And ladies and gentlemen, we are back with the Crimson Pill. I'm your host, Antonin Fiore, here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. We left off just before the break, opening our conversation about the act of legislation, the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, which created NASA itself. I'm going to read a few pieces from this just to give you more of an idea of what the real nature of NASA actually is, and the reason why it is that you haven't heard anything that has been of real, truly impactful significance that NASA has ever discovered. In Section 102, Declaration of Policy and Purpose, Article B, the Congress declares that the general welfare and security of the United States require that adequate provision be made for aeronautical and space activities. The Congress further declares that such activities shall be the responsibility of and shall be directed by a civilian agency exercising control over aeronautical and space activities sponsored by the United States. Now, up to that point, it sounds like so far so good, doesn't it? In fact, up to that point is basically the impression that we, the citizens, the taxpayers, the people who pay for their toys and their research, have been given the impression of what they are all about. But as I continue in the section and continue in the sentence, except that activities peculiar to or primarily associated with the development of weapons systems, military operations, or the defense of the United States, including the research and development necessary to make effective provision for the defense of the United States, shall be the responsibility of and shall be directed by the Department of Defense. Now, folks, there are two space programs. There's the one that you are aware of. It's called NASA. And then there is the Black Space Program, the military space program, operated, maintained by the Department of Defense. And in that program, everything that they do is kept concealed from you, is compartmentalized, is considered classified. In the civilian space program, any of the important stuff, anything with any significance, and we know from those of us who've studied 9/11, and we know the truth about 9/11. We know the truth about building number 7. We know the truth about Silverstein's comments that they pulled that building. We heard the former mayor of New York announce ahead of time and quote in interviews that they'd been given advance notice about the pulling of building number 7. We know that the towers themselves fell at faster than free fall speed. We're aware of all of these facts, and yet the official story, the official version of events continues. The lie, the cover-up, the concealment. Why? Well, it's classified. And a lot of Americans don't understand the significance of classification of information, in particularly when it's regarded as national security. There are more than one layer of classification, but once you reach